Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris at Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our good friends Sam, Clement, and Courtney Trush. Y'all say hello.
Hey, John.
Hey, John.
Hey, guys. I hope y'all had a happy Thanksgiving.
Sure. Yeah, why not?
Well, I can tell you.
How about you, John?
Well, my Thanksgiving was just fine. Thank you, Courtney. Now, if they celebrated Thanksgiving, at least our Thanksgiving, the way that we do things here in the United States, if they celebrated that over in the People's Republic of China, I'm beginning to think there are some people that work for a company called Foxconn that have not had a very good Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I don't think they're the only ones, but yeah.
No, because, Courtney, as you well know, Foxconn is one of the major suppliers or manufacturers of iPhones in the world, if not the most major one. And, they've got the major manufacturing facility over there. And, what they have happened, they employ some 200,000 people at that huge manufacturing complex. And they have locked them all in.
Locked them in.
Which is absolutely amazing. We can't even fathom that in the United States. We were sitting around moaning and groaning, wringing our hands and gnashing our teeth, Sam, about having to wear masks. However, in the People's Republic, workers are locked behind closed gates and forced to continue to work and make iPhones.
Oh, I think it's been interesting. COVID's now been going on for well over 2 years, and I think different countries and different areas of countries even more so experience that, even with a lot of these efforts, it's hard to make it completely go away. And some countries realize that quicker than others, reopening and what have you. Others tried to do extreme lockdowns for a while, and we've seen China still doing the zero COVID policy, and we've seen that it's still pretty much impossible to keep it completely under control, and that's all it does or seems to do is delay a lot of the inevitable.
Well, and of those 200,000 workers, they had recently said that they were currently operating under significantly reduced capacity because of workers not wanting to come in due to COVID fears and all of that. And then they were able to recruit 100,000 people in relatively short time, with enticing them with quadrupled daily bonuses.
If they're even going to pay them that.
Well, that's the problem,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
That's what we're seeing riots, because apparently
From what
they
level
didn't,
are we quadrupling?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. And I think that was part of it, is that they then had people that were protesting because they said that what they were promised was not delivered.
Apparently, there's just all these COVID lockdowns are really hitting sort of a fever pitch, a crescendo, if you will, if you're a music fan. And it getting to a point where we have the society over there that really doesn't tolerate protests very well.
No.
It's not just the Chinese communists. China as a whole has always kind of stressed sort of fitting in. You don't stand out too much, all that stuff. And so when you don't adhere to authority, bad things generally tend to happen, and we're seeing the government crack down on this type of stuff. I've got to ask you this, guys. How would you have taken it, in 2020? It was bad enough, I would say, most people being forced to wear masks, at least people in our area thought it was. What if, Courtney, they had said, you've been tested, we're going to post an armed guard outside of your house so you can take care of all those kids and you're not allowed to leave? How would you have liked that bad boy?
Add on top of that, hey, someone in your office tested positive.
And now you're stuck.
Now you're stuck at the
with
office.
them. Yeah, to get it, and not knowing that you even have the ability to leave if you do have a severe case to get treatment. I don't handle small spaces, nor probably someone telling me that I can't leave somewhere. So that would not go over well with me. Yeah. I don't know that I would be
pleasant to be around.
I definitely would not be pleasant to be around, but I don't know that I would protest, because it does make, you look at some of the rioters and all that. Maybe if I was behind like someone who was large and good at self-defense.
Why are you looking at me? you got one of the two right.
Great at self-defense.
Have you seen my kung fu? All right, now we digress. Courtney can't get anything else. Sam, what say you now?
Oh, it's awful, and you're seeing it. You're seeing it in department stores. There, they basically say someone's tested positive, and all of a sudden everyone starts sprinting for the exits to beat the, I guess, locking
the authorities.
in. The authorities of locking you in there. And so clearly, I don't think it's hard to imagine it having a ton of buy-in.
Well, and it did say, I saw in the article, that the people who were protesting Or after roughly 10,000. So maybe if I was like hiding around in one of the
Let's think
corners,
about that. 10,000 people protesting in a manufacturing facility.
it was a drop in, for 200,000.
But even so, that's a ton of people protesting.
It's a ton of people. So they paid them off about $1,400. That's roughly 2 months' wages just to quit and leave. Just to leave and be quiet. Like, paid them off.
Well, what do you think about that? I mean, if all of a sudden you were to, raise holy hell out in the parking lot and Scott Reed came out and said, hey, here we're going to give you 2 months' salary to go home and shut up, what would you do, Courtney?
Well, I think for those 10,000 people, they just didn't want to get locked in there. That was probably pretty good money. I don't know. I don't think I would prefer Scott Reed to tell me.
Business.
Yeah.
2 months, it's pretty risky.
It's pretty risky. What do you think?
Roll the dice.
Yeah.
Courtney's mum's the word at this point.
Yeah.
So,
She's thinking over the hypothetical offer.
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's all happening. It's coming to head with the Foxconn protests and all that stuff. However, with I would say the turning back of individual rights over the last several years in the PRC as well as Hong Kong, Macau, and how they have adopted this zero tolerance COVID policy, it's kind of making me wonder just how much longer can American companies continue to place so much importance on China as being sort of the factory or the machine shop for the world, the sweatshop for the world, and when will they start sort of diversifying away from China en masse? I mean,
Right.
en masse. We try to do it a little bit, we'll go to Indonesia a little bit, but when do they finally start saying, we can't put up with this any longer, we have got to find other sources?
Well, I think it's the same thing I think people are experiencing in the market too, say just the stock market. What's the saying that people, gain wealth in concentration and keep it in diversification, and I think it's the same thing with what these companies have been experiencing. When the market was easy, it was okay to be concentrated, and when the economy was fantastic, it was pretty okay to be concentrated
Sure.
for the most part. But it's when stuff really hits the fan that you start to see the added value of being conservative through diversifying the countries that you're building your products in, and I think it's something we're going to continue to see. I mean, you and I both had tons of questions about onshoring and what the impact of this is going to be for onshoring, and I think both of our answers were, a lot of it's probably not coming back here, but a lot of it's probably going somewhere else.
Yeah.
But you have to have that skilled labor for a lot of this tech
And
industry items.
and at the right price too,
Right.
which I think
That's
is a lot of the
important.
question for onshoring is, people, a lot of the things that left here in the 50s through 70s, 80s, really even now,
Even
I mean,
now,
still
yeah.
leaving. Those jobs are the kinds that aren't coming back. Those very, capital intensive, human intensive jobs.
Again, however, I would say this. I would think probably those low batch, high margin sort of manufacturers, I would say a lot of them could end up being onshoring, but
Right.
the iPhone's not a low batch
No,
sort of type
yeah.
deal, even if it is high margin. And so what we have seen is Foxconn, it's a Taiwanese company, is starting to look at its manufacturing facilities in other countries, notably India, at its manufacturing plant. They already produce iPhones outside of Chennai, which used to be Madras. I can't pronounce the name of the town. It's like Sri Sarapudabar or something like that.
Sounds
Sounds
right.
good.
It sounds okay. It's a suburb of Chennai. They've been making iPhones there for a while, but what they do is they make older versions of the iPhones. The iPhone 14, which is the current version, those are being made in China, and now Foxconn and Apple are saying we're going to start shifting some production over to India, and right now they're anticipating quadrupling the workforce in that facility over the next 2 years, quadrupling. It's still not going to get to anywhere near as big as that 200,000 employee facility in China, but we're talking about making some significant shifts in its production to India. And I wonder if other countries, notably I would say the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, whether or not they're to follow.
Well, I do think the one interesting caveat to all this is, diversifying it out. The U.S. is relatively expensive, but you've seen it a little bit starting with the semiconductor industry.
That's
It
right.
is defending against those tail risks, for what I would call, those things that are very unlikely to happen, but have very drastic implications on your overall business. And at what point does it make sense to have things you maybe pay a little bit more for here in the United States that you can always get to and always produce? And I think we are going to see probably a little bit of shift, maybe some production here domestically, but just again shifting it out of just one country in general, whether that's here, China, India, what have you. I don't think that makes sense for really anyone.
Well, and to your point, John, 2020, we started seeing the shutdowns in China.
That's right.
And now we are in 2022, almost
And it's still going
2023, still going on. And they, someone was quoted in the article of saying every week that the shutdown is happening and the unrest in China, Apple is losing $1 billion. $1 billion in iPhone sales. That's significant money. To your point, Sam, if that's a leading indicator of a company looking at diversifying their location of producing their goods, I would think that's a pretty good
that may
pushing
make
point.
sense
Yeah.
$1 billion
to
bucks?
onshore.
A week, that's
billion
a lot.
a week to onshore some things. Yeah, maybe even if, even in this situation, maybe you break even, but, it gets rid of some of those, what I would call tail risk.
Well, the thing is, and people would be, obviously the knee-jerk reaction would be Apple's in control of this. Or they're not really in control of it. It's their suppliers.
Right.
Foxconn's the biggest one. There are a couple of other ones that they get most of their iPhone production out of. And it's the Foxconn that's got to make the decision whether or not to divest or reduce their capacity in China, take it elsewhere. And where do they go? The thing is, you need to have an economy where you have a large enough population, where you have enough capital, where you have enough infrastructure where they could reasonably expect to supplant the Chinese capacity.
There's not tons of options for that, though.
There aren't that many options. You certainly
I don't
can't
know
do it in a Laos or a Cambodia. Maybe
Indonesia.
Maybe
some.
Indonesia. But Thailand's probably the labor costs a little bit too high. Clearly, Japan and South Korea, obviously even Taiwan. So all of a sudden, India is, in my estimation, have this once in maybe a lifetime, generation,
Right.
century sort of opportunity that if New Delhi can get out of the way, where they can really start to make some inroads. And I did a little research on this. What makes India particularly attractive is, in particular, a place like Chennai. It already has a decent infrastructure by India's standards, well-educated population. It has a per capita income not dissimilar to, say, Mexico. So it's not the squalor that a lot of people think of when they think of like Calcutta and what have you. A little bit different type of situation. But also India as a whole only imports about 12 to 13% of its overall imports from China. When you compare that to countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and elsewhere, those numbers are like over 30%. So if I'm going to diversify out of China to, say, Indonesia and Vietnam, however, they get 30 to 35% of their imports, I'm not really diversifying. So I need to diversify away from China, not just physical location, but where my suppliers will get their intermediate parts.
It seems like Mexico is also going to be one that could possibly benefit.
They got that crown down there.
I know, but talking about onshoring and what that looks like, that seems to be an intermediate step between that and onshoring, is at least being able to drive your goods to where you need them to be.
Well, and you look at also the fact that the same issues with China, the same shutdowns, the protests, all that, it's not just affecting Apple, right?
That's
It is
right.
global, that it's affecting markets throughout the world. And while it's probably not significant, y'all can speak to the actual, percentages. But I think that's something that every country is probably looking at, every industry is looking at, like how dependent we are on China.
Oh, well, they certainly are. And it has to give American businesses some semblance of pause to sit there and see how Xi Jinping has consolidated his power, how he's been named, for all intents and purposes, president for life, how crackdown on democracy, or the second way down in Hong Kong, what they're seeing in terms of just the quashing of dissent, and even with the zero-tolerance COVID policy, this doesn't seem to be the type of place that would really adhere to the rule of law nor protect strong individual property rights. So even with the current protests and quashing of that, I'm kind of thinking to myself, do I need to get out of here while I still can?
Right.
We talked when COVID was kind of really first taking hold about what these longer term implications were going to be.
Right.
And that was probably one that I think we felt most confident in, but also was going to take the longest time to figure out. It is the diversification of supply chains, infrastructure, what have you, away from, one, China, due to how strict they've been, but two, just in general, creating other avenues to get your products to market and what have you. And I think that's something we're seeing a little bit of. the companies have invested billions and
That's
billions
the
and
problem.
billions of
Trying
dollars
to write
there.
that off, all of a sudden, the drop of a hat, maybe something could change in the next 2 or 3 years. You don't want to go and all of a
kinda-
sudden write down a bunch of stuff called $1 billion in write-offs.
You can't almost.
It's
I mean,
tough.
it's almost impossible. And so I think it's something, instead of a fully walking away, you're going to kind of see this slow backwards shuffle and maybe like start to take a little bit of, or investing less in it than you maybe previously had, build up other places without really necessarily detracting from China. And then, as you build up others, start to pull the production away.
Do you think this is unique to China? That this is something with the communist rule and all that? I mean, could you see something similar or another issue coming to China in 10 years?
I think what makes this unique about
Not China.
China.
I'm sorry, India.
Oh, well, I was going to say what makes it unique about China, why they're the talking point, is they're massive. India is too, but they're massive. They're extremely controlled by a dictator, essentially, right now. Cost of labor has been very cheap there, and they have relatively strong infrastructure.
They have a good technical ability.
Yeah,
of
and
their
so
workforce.
there's not many places that I think are comparable to China in
Yeah.
that regard. And
It's-
that also is what makes it hard to kind of walk away
right
from
to
it.
run. Yeah.
And the thing is, to maybe answer your question a different way, yeah, it's possible in India. It's at some point. India needs to get out of its own way. It's always had sort of a lot of protectionism in terms of their tariffs and their business policies. But if they could get out of their way, they could easily have a massive increase in overall living standards and get to be the next China, if you will. And that'd be painful to Indians' ears to sit there and call them the next China. And then after that, you never know what's going to happen. While it's the world's largest and arguably maybe the most messy democracy, it is still a democracy, and they hold fair elections and all that. So it doesn't really have a history of dictatorship the same way that China has. So I can't really
But
answer your question like that.
What's interesting is these two countries are so off in their own realm in terms of size. I mean, you could remove 1 billion people from each of these countries, and they'd still be the two biggest, most populated countries on
That's
Earth.
so weird to think about, isn't
1
it?
billion from each, wipe them off the face of the Earth, and they're still the two biggest countries.
What's the general geographic area? I mean, comparing India to China.
Do you have another question?
I know.
I'm not
I know,
exactly
I'm just
sure.
on the spot. Well, because I'm just curious. You said that China is like massive. Obviously, they have a huge population, but also just the general size. I mean, it's no Russia, but it's a large.
I think China's
landmass.
comparable to maybe the United States in terms of size, and India's smaller than that.
Okay.
What's interesting about China, though, is there's so many massive cities.
Right.
I mean, that's
I hope the same is even true in India. This town that I can't pronounce, it's outside of Chennai, where this Apple manufacturing facility, they call it a town.
Right.
200,000 people.
But then you have 20 cities
little village.
bigger than
Yes.
New York or something in
It's
China. I mean,
nuts.
the 20th biggest city there is bigger than what people would say is the
Yeah, well, ask the average American whether or not they'd ever heard of Wuhan before COVID, and they go, no, they might not. A lot of them might not even still know it today. But that Wuhan's what, 10 to 15 million people?
right.
It's just it's hard to comprehend.
yeah.
It really is.
And there's tons of them. Bigger than New York City that people have never, ever heard of in their life.
Yeah, so I would say trying to replace China in that regard, India's the most logical next step. Indonesia will get some. Philippines, if they can get out of their own way, they'll get some. The Vietnamese will get some. But in terms of the overall potential and capacity for additional capacity, India stands a lot to gain right now.
Absolutely, and a lot of it's going to depend on Modi's and the rest of the gang's policy or policies going forward.
Without a doubt. And all this, Courtney, all this hits at an awful time for me. I'm sitting here looking at my phone, and I got my phone maybe during the, Pleasantine, a long time ago. It's an 8.
It is. Oh wow.
It's an 8.
Yeah, yours is.
I
thought mine was.
I can't even replace it.
No.
And the thing is, I need to get a new one, but I mean, I don't want to spend up to get a 14, particularly and wait a long period of time.
Yeah, you probably
So-
wouldn't get it by Christmas.
No, well, I'd be buying it for myself. I don't care about Christmas in that regard. But in any event, it is going to be interesting to see what these protests, whether or not they lead to other protests. I mean, I was alive and I remember the Tiananmen Square protests and how that just sort of seemed to come out of the ether in some regard. Whether or not these protests will end up finding their way to Beijing, and just exactly what the Chinese Communist Party does about it.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah,
be
and how it
interesting.
affects all of us,
Well, it certainly will affect all of us.
especially you getting your iPhone 14.
Tell me about it. All right, gang. Thank you all so much for listening. We always love to hear from you. Also, if you have any comments or questions, please, by all means, let us know. You can always drop us a line at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, where you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. As always, if you're interested in reading more, hearing more of what we have to say or how we think, by all means, please go to oakworth.com, take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab for all kinds of exciting information.
That's all I got.
Nothing.
Y'all
New,
have anything
John?
else to say today?
He knew what you were going to say.
Well, the
you said it.
only thing that I've got to say is, and I didn't mention it earlier, is I'm looking forward to potentially running interference for Courtney whenever she goes to the shopping malls, because I, need someone large and
In charge.
large and in charge and good at defending themselves.
That's right.
So there you have it.
Thank you, John.
All right, guys. Thank y'all so much. Y'all take care.